Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. This time, we're going back to the Spanish Civil War. But we're looking at it through a really specific lens.
That's right.
We're using Paul Preston's book, The Spanish Holocaust, to explore how religion, specifically Catholicism, ended up playing a role in the unbelievable violence that consumed Spain in the 1930s.
It's fascinating stuff. I mean, Preston really goes beyond the typical, battles and dates that you might find in a more general history of the war.
Yeah, and we have to acknowledge right up front that this is a difficult topic.
Absolutely.
We are not here to take sides or to endorse any particular viewpoint, but to let Preston's work guide us. As always, we are simply trying to report on what the source says.
Exactly. We're here to understand the historical context and how these incredibly complex and often really brutal forces were at play.
So let's set the scene. Spain in the 1930s. The Second Republic had been established in 1931, only a few years before the outbreak of the war.
Yeah.
And from the very beginning, it faced fierce opposition from conservative groups, especially, as we said, the Catholic Church. Why was that?
Well, the church had held immense power for centuries in Spain. I mean, you can't really separate it from the state. Education, daily life, it was all so intertwined. So when the Republic started implementing policies that were perceived as anti-clerical,
Right.
It wasn't just about politics. It felt like a direct attack, an attack on the very fabric of Spanish society.
Okay, so let's get into specifics.
Yeah.
What were some of these policies that caused so much tension?
Some, on the surface at least, could seem kind of minor, like removing religious symbols from public spaces or maybe banning bell ringing.
Right.
Or even taxing religious practices. But for a lot of Spanish Catholics, especially those who are more conservative, these weren't small things at all.
Right.
It was a direct assault on their faith, on their way of life. Put yourself in their shoes. If suddenly your government was restricting the way you practiced your religion, it would feel threatening.
Yeah, absolutely. And Preston actually gives us a bunch of really vivid examples of just how much this tension was building.
Oh, yeah.
He talks about this guy, Aparicio Albiñana. He was a novelist who, I'm not sure if he actually believed it or if he was just trying to sell books, but he was peddling conspiracy theories about this Masonic Soviet plot to destroy Spain.
Yeah.
And as out there as that might sound, it really resonated with some folks.
Oh, yeah, especially people who are already feeling threatened by the Republic's reforms. These ideas gave their fears a name, a target.
Exactly. And Albiñana didn't just write about it. He formed a political party, and their stated goal was chilling. To annihilate, that was the word they used, the internal enemies of the fatherland.
Wow.
And this guy, they even had their own militia, with blue shirts and Roman salutes.
Uh-oh. Chilling indeed. It sounds a lot like the early days of the fascist movements that were picking up steam all across Europe at the time.
It does, doesn't it? And it wasn't just the fringe figures. Preston also points to a much more mainstream Catholic leader, Gil Robles.
Right.
Now, Robles himself was a lawyer, so he at least publicly advocated for legality. But that didn't stop him from using some pretty inflammatory language.
Oh, like what?
Oh, he would call Republicans things like coming from cesspools of iniquity. Imagine hearing that about your political opponents.
Yeah, that's pretty harsh.
And he also really played up the fear of a communist takeover, which, given what was happening in Russia, was not an unfounded fear.
Right.
So, again, he wasn't openly calling for violence, at least not in those speeches. But his words absolutely helped create this atmosphere of fear and suspicion. And once you have that...
well, violence becomes more likely. It's almost like it becomes, permissible.
Yeah, almost inevitable in a way.
Right.
So we have this backdrop, right? Rising tensions fueled by anxieties that were both political and religious. But how do we go from angry words, from heated rhetoric to actual bloodshed?
Well, you can't ignore the role of these militant right-wing groups that started gaining more and more influence. Groups like the Phalange and the Requetés. Right.
These weren't just political parties. They were more like paramilitary organizations. They had uniforms. They did drills. And, they were ready and willing to use violence to achieve their goals.
So who were these groups? What were their beliefs? What did they want?
Well, the Phalange, for example, they were inspired by, they were basically fascists, taking cues from what Mussolini was doing in Italy.
Right.
They wanted to create a totalitarian Spain with a strong emphasis on nationalism and Catholic identity. The Requetés, on the other hand, they were monarchists, deeply rooted in this tradition called Carlism, and they were absolutely dedicated to defending the church no matter the cost.
So dedicated to the church that they were willing to use violence.
Oh, yeah.
And then you can't talk about the lead up to the Civil War without mentioning the 1934 Asturian miners' revolt.
Right. That was a major turning point. I mean, that wasn't just a protest. It was a full-blown armed uprising. Hundreds of people died. Yeah, I mean, that's when any remaining hope for, I don't know, peaceful coexistence really started to evaporate.
Yeah.
It showed that both the left and the right were willing to use force to achieve their aims.
And the government's brutal response, I mean, the way they put down the miners' revolt, it just added fuel to the fire. It bred even more resentment and mistrust.
Yeah. And then, to make things even worse, just as the country was trying to recover from this incredibly violent episode, a prominent right-wing politician, Jose Calvo Sotelo, was assassinated.
Oh, man, that was a huge turning point. Sotelo was, he was a very vocal critic of the Republic, a real powerful figure on the right. And even though a lot of people, even on the right, condemned the assassination, some saw it as, well, as justification for an uprising. It was a spark that ignited the tinderbox.
So it really does feel like Spain was almost destined for war at that point. I mean, were there any voices of moderation trying to, pump the brakes at all?
Of course there were. You always have those voices. But they were, increasingly drowned out, by this rising tide of extremism from both sides. The political center was disappearing, and moderates were caught in this really dangerous crossfire.
And it wasn't just Spain that was caught up in all this. I mean, the rest of Europe was watching.
Oh, yeah.
And some saw an opportunity.
Absolutely. Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, they were both really eager to expand their influence.
Right.
And they saw the Spanish Civil War as this chance to test out their new weapons and tactics and, maybe weaken their rivals. So they started sending financial aid and weapons to the rebel faction led by General Francisco Franco.
So by 1936, Spain was this powder keg ready to explode. And when it did, the violence was just, it was horrifying. And I think we need to be very clear here.
Yes.
Spanish Civil War wasn't a simple good versus evil story. Both sides committed atrocities, and Preston doesn't shy away from showing the dark side of both the rebel and Republican factions.
That's so important. It's always tempting to simplify history, divide everyone into heroes and villains. But the Spanish Civil War was full of moral ambiguities. In war, in that chaos, it's all too easy for the lines between right and wrong to get blurred.
Yeah. I mean, just one example. Preston describes this massacre in Alcalá de los Gazules, where rebel forces working with local phalangists seized control of the town and just murdered the mayor, town councilors, tons of others.
It's a reminder of how quickly violence can spiral out of control, especially when it's fueled by political and ideological fervor. Suddenly, people are doing things they never would have imagined in peacetime.
And then there's this guy, Gonzalo Queiporiano, a rebel general.
Oh, yeah.
He became infamous for his just absolutely ruthless repression of Seville. He used radio broadcasts to spread propaganda and incite violence. And often, he would exaggerate his own victories and just completely demonize his opponents.
It's one thing to report the news, but what he was doing, it was like psychological warfare. It created this atmosphere of terror where violence became not only acceptable, but expected.
Yeah. Preston also talks about this military judge, Francisco Bojorquez Vicina.
Oh, gosh, that was a dark chapter.
Yeah, this guy, he would preside over these basically summary executions. I mean, imagine being told that your fate depends on the impression your face makes on the judges.
It's hard to even comprehend that level of cruelty, how the rule of law can just crumble in times of conflict.
It makes you wonder how anyone can become so callous, to just disregard human life so casually.
It's a reminder of what can happen when ideology takes over, when it completely trumps justice, when it becomes the only lens through which you see the world.
And of course, there's the case of Federico Garcia Lorca.
The poet.
Yeah. One of Spain's most famous poets, murdered by, it's widely believed, phalangists in Granada.
His death, it's symbolic of just how senseless the violence was. He wasn't a politician or a soldier, he was an artist. It shows how even those who stand outside the political arena can become targets.
And the rebels, they didn't even try to hide their motivations. They actually declared their rebellion a holy rebellion against what they called the Red Camp.
Oh, wow. So they were very explicitly framing the conflict as a religious crusade.
Exactly. Which, of course, just poured fuel on the fire of the religious tensions that were already so high.
It's a classic tactic, isn't it? Casting your opponents as not just wrong, but evil, godless, a threat to everything you hold dear. It's how you justify the unjustifiable.
Exactly. But we have to remember, the Republican side had its own darkness, its own capacity for brutality. I mean, especially in the early days of the war, there were plenty of instances of violence and repression by Republican forces, particularly in those areas where anarchist groups like the CNT-FAI held sway.
Right, the anarchists. Their goals, I mean, were rooted in social justice and freedom, but they were really divided when it came to violence.
Yeah. Some factions really believed that any means were justified in the fight against fascism.
And that led to some really horrific acts.
Preston talks about the uncontrolled violence that happened in Barcelona. You had these anarchist control patrols driving around in these unmarked cars, making arrests, carrying out executions, all without any real due process.
Scary stuff. Those ghost cars, they called them, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was a terrifying time to be in Barcelona, especially if you were suspected of being a fascist or even just a counter-revolutionary.
And then there was the Columna de Hierro, that anarchist militia that was known for its brutal tactics.
Right. I mean, they were fierce fighters, but they were also responsible for attacks on priests, on civilians, on anyone they perceived as an enemy.
It just goes to show, even within the Republican side, there were these deep internal conflicts and power struggles, and sometimes they led to violence that was just as horrific as the atrocities committed by the rebels.
So it's crucial to remember that the Spanish Civil War was not a simple good versus evil story. There was violence, there was injustice on both sides.
Exactly. It's a complex, multi-layered conflict, and if we want to learn from it, we have to understand that complexity.
Absolutely. But before we go any further, I think we need to talk about one of the most controversial events of the war, the Paracuellos massacre.
Right. That was a dark chapter.
Yeah. As the Republican government was fleeing Madrid, thousands of prisoners were executed without trial.
It's a really disturbing event, and there's still a lot of debate about, how much the Republican government was actually involved. But regardless of who gave the orders, it really highlights the climate of fear and desperation that gripped the Republican side as the war turned against them.
And then to add another layer of complexity, you have the assassination of Undrenin.
The leader of the POU.
Yeah, the POM. They were an anti-Stalinist communist party. And they basically just challenged the dominant narrative of the Soviet Union, which was supporting the Republican government.
Right.
So Nin ends up assassinated, probably by Soviet agents, which just shows how far-reaching these ideological battles actually were.
His death is this tragic example of how, even within the left, there were these really bitter rivalries and divisions that could turn deadly.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, a lot of really heartbreaking and disturbing events. But what does it all mean? What are some of the, the key takeaways we can glean from these accounts of violence and repression in the Spanish Civil War?
Well, I think one of the things that jumps out at me is how, violence begets violence. The Spanish Civil War wasn't just a clash of ideologies. It was a cycle of revenge and retribution. Each act of cruelty on either side just fueled the flames of hatred, making further violence more and more likely.
Yeah, it's this really chilling pattern that we see repeat itself throughout history, isn't it? It's how societies descend into this, almost a madness, when fear and hatred and this demonization of anyone who's different takes hold.
And Preston really highlights the role of those in power in shaping those narratives, whether it's politicians using inflammatory rhetoric or religious figures justifying violence. Words have consequences.
They really do. So in this climate of fear and violence, were there any glimmers of hope? Were there any individuals who resisted the pull of this violence?
There were. Even in the darkest times, you find these incredible stories of courage and compassion. Preston writes about this guy, Melchor Rodriguez Garcia. He was an anarchist, and he ended up saving thousands of lives by providing refuge for people who were being targeted during all the chaos and violence in Barcelona. They called him the Red Angel.
That's amazing.
Right. It just goes to show you that even in the face of just overwhelming cruelty, individuals can choose to be forces for good.
Yeah, his story and the stories of others like him, they're really important. It's this reminder that even when it feels like the whole world has gone mad, there are still individuals who choose humanity, who choose compassion.
And that brings us to a crucial question, something for our listeners to think about. How do societies grapple with the legacy of this kind of intense political violence, especially when it's so closely tied to deeply held beliefs, like religion?
It's a question that has relevance far beyond the Spanish Civil War, I think. How do we prevent history from repeating itself? How do we learn from the mistakes of the past to build a more just and peaceful future?
big questions, but essential ones. And I think Preston's work gives us, I don't know, a starting point for that conversation. We have to understand the past in all its complexity if we want to create a better future.
And it's not like the violence just stopped when the war ended in 1939.
Oh, no, not at all. Preston doesn't stop there. He goes on to show how the Franco regime that took over, well, they continued the repression. I mean, it wasn't as overtly violent, but they used fear and silence to maintain control.
It's like the trauma of the war just seeped into everything. And that brings us to something we touched on earlier, the international dimension of the war. We talked about the support Franco got from Italy and Germany. But there's another side to this story, the international volunteers who came to fight for the Republic.
Ah, yes, the international brigades. People who came from all over the world to fight against fascism, to defend democracy. They were driven by idealism, by this sense of international solidarity. Really inspiring when you think about the risks they were taking, knowing that many of them wouldn't make it home.
Yeah, they came from all walks of life, too.
Yeah.
Writers, artists, intellectuals, workers, students, all united in this common cause.
It really shows how the Spanish Civil War wasn't just a Spanish conflict. I mean, it was a battleground in this much larger ideological struggle that was playing out all across Europe and really the world.
And that international element actually leads to some pretty tragic episodes, like the persecution of the POUM.
The POUM. Oh, right. They were that anti-Stalinist communist party.
Yeah.
They really believed in this more decentralized form of socialism. You know, they opposed Stalin's authoritarianism. But that put them in direct conflict with the Soviet Union, which, as you said, was supporting the Republic.
So it ended up being targeted.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Preston describes how Soviet agents were basically working to silence any dissent within the Republican ranks. And they were probably behind the assassination of the POUM leader, Andrei Nin.
It's hard to wrap your head around that.
Yeah.
Like, even within the group fighting fascism, there were these deadly rivalries and purges.
It's a reminder that things are rarely, if ever, black and white. Even those fighting on the quote-unquote same side can have very different goals and very different methods.
So we've talked about, I don't know, I guess you could say the macro level, the causes, the consequences, the political machinations. But what about the human cost? What can we learn from the individual stories of the people who actually lived through this?
Well, that's where Preston really shines as a historian.
Yeah.
He doesn't just focus on the big picture, you know, the battles and the politics. He zooms in on the individual lives that were shattered by the war.
He writes about these farmers who had to flee their land,
Yep.
families torn apart, children. I mean, just imagine witnessing these horrors at such a young age. These stories that they make the war so much more real, you know, than just reading about troop movements and casualty figures.
Exactly. You can't just skim over those personal stories. We read about the summary executions, the torture, the people who just disappeared. Preston doesn't shy away from the difficult details, but he does it in a way that respects the victims.
And it wasn't over when the fighting stopped. I mean, Preston describes the psychological impact, how the fear lingered for decades. I mean, imagine living in a society where you can't even talk about your experiences, where the past is just shrouded in silence.
And he talks about the impact on the families, the wives, the mothers, who spent years searching for their loved ones, never knowing what happened to them, the children who grew up without parents, the communities that were just shattered. It's tough to read, for sure, but it's essential for understanding what the war really did to Spain.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about, you know, dates and battles. It's about the lives of real people. And it really, I don't know, I guess it forces us to confront, I don't know, like this dual nature of humanity. Our capacity for immense cruelty, but also our amazing resilience.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And that duality is something Preston navigates really well, too, because he doesn't shy away from the brutality of both sides. But he also, I think, avoids these simplistic judgments.
What do you mean?
Well, he acknowledges that people were making these incredibly difficult choices. You know, it was this time of extreme polarization. Violence was everywhere. And for many people, there were no easy answers. They were caught between these competing loyalties and moral dilemmas.
So he's not letting anyone off the hook, but he's also recognizing that context matters.
Exactly. I mean, he talks about the people who were trying to maintain some semblance of order in the Republican zone. They were caught between the need to suppress rebel sympathizers, but also, you know, wanting to prevent these extrajudicial killings. It's a tough spot to be in.
Yeah, I can't even imagine the weight of those decisions. Like knowing that anything you do could have these horrible consequences.
And he also looks at those who join the rebels. I mean, for some, it was this ideological conviction. They really believed that they were saving Spain from, communism, from anarchy.
Right.
But others, they were motivated by opportunism or fear, just trying to survive, to protect themselves, or maybe even just to get ahead.
So it wasn't just these pure ideological motivations driving the conflict. There were all these other factors at play.
Exactly. Preston shows us that history isn't black and white, It's full of these shades of gray, and it makes you consider the perspectives of everyone involved, even those whose actions you might find reprehensible.
So I guess the question is, after exploring all this, what does it all mean for us today? What are the lessons we can take away from this incredibly dark chapter of history?
Well, one big one is just the danger of political polarization. The way demonizing your opponents can lead to violence. I mean, the Spanish Civil War is like a case study in how quickly rhetoric can escalate, how societies can just, break apart.
Yeah. And it feels, sadly, very relevant today, especially with the rise of social media and the echo chambers we all find ourselves in.
Right. It's a reminder that we have to protect those democratic institutions, the things like the rule of law that can so easily be eroded when things get chaotic.
And that we need to keep talking to each other,
Yeah.
to try to understand perspectives that are different from our own.
Exactly. And another lesson is just never forget the victims. Preston's work shows us that behind all the statistics, the battles, the political maneuvering, there are real people who suffered and died.
It's easy to get lost in the big picture, but those individual stories, they're the ones that really stay with you.
And that brings us to a question for you to think about. How can we prevent this from happening again? What can we do to make sure that the sacrifices of those who fought and died are not in vain?
Yeah, how do we create a more just and peaceful world where these kinds of atrocities don't happen?
Big questions, but essential ones. And I think Preston's book, it gives us a way to start thinking about them.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that understanding the past is essential to creating a better future.
It's amazing. We've talked for, a while now, and I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of this incredibly complex and tragic conflict.
It's true. Preston's book is just so packed with details and insights. But I think one of the most important takeaways is, the way he weaves together all these different aspects of the war, the political, the social, the religious. It's like he's created this tapestry, this incredibly rich and nuanced picture of what happened.
And he doesn't flinch from showing us the darkness, the brutality, the injustice, but he also highlights those moments of courage, of resilience, of compassion that somehow managed to shine through.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so powerful, I think, because it's not just, a dry history book. It's a story about people, about the choices we make, about the consequences we face, about how even in the face of just horrific circumstances, the human spirit can endure.
Now, speaking of enduring, I want to touch on this one last theme that Preston explores, and that's the role of memory. For decades, the Spanish Civil War was this silenced conflict. People were afraid to talk about it.
That's right. Under Franco, any discussion of the war that, challenged the regime's version of events was basically forbidden. So the victors, they got to write the history books, and the voices of the defeated, the victims, they were just silenced.
And so many families were left with unanswered questions.
Yeah.
About what happened to their loved ones.
Yeah.
And they couldn't even mourn openly.
Yeah. It's hard to imagine carrying that weight, that silence, for so many years.
So when did that start to change? I mean, when did Spain finally start to confront its past?
Well, it really wasn't until after Franco died in 1975 and Spain started to transition to democracy. That's when people could finally begin to talk about the war openly, to try to understand what had happened.
But that must have been incredibly difficult, right? To finally start sharing those stories, those memories after so many years of silence.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was a long and painful process full of disagreements about how to move forward. Some people just wanted to forget it ever happened, to just bury the past and move on. But others, they demanded justice. They wanted to hold those responsible for the crimes of the Franco regime accountable.
It sounds like, a really difficult balancing act, right? Between the need for justice and the desire for healing.
It was, and it's still ongoing in a lot of ways. But there have been these really important efforts to recover the historical memory of the war,
Right.
to document the atrocities, to honor the victims. There are groups who are still working to exhume mass graves, to identify the remains of those who disappeared, to give some closure to the families who are still searching for answers.
That's such important work. And I think it brings us back to something we talked about earlier, this idea that history isn't just dates and battles, it's about people. And I think, listening to those individual stories, preserving those memories, sharing those experiences, that's a way to honor the victims, to acknowledge their suffering.
Exactly. And it's also a way to make sure that the lessons of the war, the really hard lessons about the dangers of hatred, of intolerance, of violence, are not forgotten. That's how we prevent the past from repeating itself.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you all, our listeners, for joining us on this deep dive into the Spanish Civil War.
Yeah, thanks for listening. It's been a challenging journey, for sure, but hopefully a rewarding one.
If you're interested in learning more, I definitely recommend checking out Preston's book. It's a powerful and thought-provoking read, and we hope that this conversation has inspired you to continue exploring this period of history, to think about the legacy of the war, and to consider what it means for us today.
Because, as we've seen, the Spanish Civil War may be a distant event, but the questions it raises about conflict, about ideology, about the very nature of humanity, those are questions that are still relevant, maybe now more than ever.
So keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving for a world where these kinds of horrors are never repeated. Until next time, keep diving deep.